In 325, Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, hoping to forge a singular, unified faith that would bind his fractured empire together. The emperor hoped that the council would settle the matter for good. He could not have been more wrong. Instead of the intended harmony, the church plunged into over half a century of political purges, betrayal, and relentless theological conflict. Successive emperors utilized exile as a weapon to stifle dissent. Rival synods hurled condemnations at each other, and the future of Christianity rested on a fierce dispute over a single Greek term. From trumped-up murder accusations to the clandestine disposition of bishops, the crisis that followed Nicaea forever transformed the landscape of the Roman world. Before the dust settled, it would require a fresh imperial vision, a rising capital city, and a second ecumenical gathering to finally resolve the bitter struggle. The Council of Nicaea in 325 was supposed to settle the Arian Controversy, but the agreements reached at Nicaea didn't even last until the end of the decade. Arianism dealt with the nature of Christ in relationship to God the Father. The movement's namesake, Arius, was a North African priest who preached that Christ was created by God the Father and was therefore not fully equal to God the Father. At Nicaea, bishops from across the Roman Empire rejected this view, declaring Christ to be of the same essence as the Father. They used the Greek word homoousios. The problem, though, was that homoousios was itself controversial, and the debate was never simply Arians versus Nicaeans. Many bishops believed Christ to be of similar essence, but not fully the same essence. The Greek word for this is homoiousios, and this tiny difference in wording mattered a lot to 4th century Christians. So it did not take long for the cracks patched by Nicaea to reopen. In Anatolia, Eusebius of Nicaea, who had signed on to the Nicene Creed, still supported Arius and refused to condemn him. This led to Constantine exiling Eusebius only a few months after the Council of Nicaea had closed. But Eusebius had close ties to the imperial family, and Constantine readmitted him in 328. Later, in 339, he was made Bishop of Constantinople. A man with strong Arian sympathies then occupied one of the most important positions in the Eastern Church. In Alexandria, another powerful hub, the young Athanasius of Alexandria was made bishop in 328. Athanasius, only around 30 years old at this time, had made a name for himself arguing steadfastly against the Arians. He now led a divided community in Arius' home city. Athanasius was young, uncompromising, and a fierce defender of the Nicene orthodoxy. He would be at the center of church controversy for the next 50 years. In 335, Eusebius and other bishops hostile to Athanasius brought several charges against him at a synod at Tyre, the wildest being the accusation that Athanasius had murdered a bishop named Arsenius and cut off his hands. Athanasius defended himself by having Arsenius himself walk into the building and wave his hands around to prove to the congregation that he was both alive and had not been ciceroed. But despite this charge being clearly trumped up, the Eusebian faction found grounds to exile Athanasius to Trier. While Athanasius was struggling not to be thrown out, Arius was fighting to get back in the door. He appealed directly to Constantine, and the emperor found his statements to be convincing enough. Constantine ordered Alexander, then the Bishop of Constantinople, to receive Arius back into the church. Alexander was not happy with this at all, but when Constantine says jump, you ask how high. Arius made his way to the capital, but the day before the ceremony was to take place, he had a bit of a problem. According to accounts, and I'm being serious here, Arius became violently ill, rushed into a public toilet, and suffered severe bleeding, causing his death. Yes, you heard that right. Arius bled out while sitting on a public toilet. That's a hell of a way to go. His opponents cited this as divine punishment for his heresy. Modern historians have suggested other possibilities, namely that he may have been poisoned. But he was also around 80 years old at the time and might just have gotten very sick very quickly. We'll never have the real answer. Arius' death was not the end of the controversy, though. His ideas had already spread far and wide across the empire, especially in the east. The next year, in 337, Constantine died. He was famously baptized on his deathbed by Eusebius of Nicaea. He was succeeded by his sons, Constantius II, Constans, and Constantine II. In 340, Constantine II was killed, leaving the empire once again divided into two halves. This new leadership changed the dynamics. Constans and Constantine II were both Nicaean, but Constantius favored the anti-Nicaean factions in the east. In the name of unity, they had all agreed to allow many exiled bishops to return to their sees, including Athanasius. But Eusebius wasn't ready to back down. A synod at Antioch installed Gregory of Cappadocia as the bishop of Alexandria, and again deposed Athanasius, who fled to Rome and appealed to Pope Julius. The Pope called a council to deal with this problem, which convened in Rome in 340 and ruled in Athanasius' favor. The Eastern bishops had largely declined to attend this council, and then rejected the decisions. They held their own synod in Antioch in 341, which reaffirmed their opposition to Athanasius. So there were now two competing councils coming to opposing decisions. Constans tried to bring the two sides together at Serdica, but this council fell apart when the Western bishops tried to seat Athanasius himself. The Eastern bishops opposed this because they felt that he should not be able to sit on a council that was determining his own fate. They abandoned Serdica and reconvened at Philippopolis. The Western bishops still went ahead with the council at Serdica and ruled in favor of Athanasius. The Eastern bishops at Philippopolis naturally found against him. So once again, two councils, two opposing decisions. There was now a clear divide between Eastern and Western bishops, and the respective emperors each favored their own faction. For the first time, theological disagreements were beginning to align with political boundaries. These differences would heal, reopen, and evolve over the coming centuries. But here, in the mid-4th century, these differences were huge. In 344, Western bishops representing Constans were sent to Antioch with letters of support for Athanasius. According to ancient sources, the bishop of Antioch, Stephen, himself opposed to Athanasius, attempted to frame the delegation by arranging for a prostitute to be smuggled into the room where the bishops were staying in the hopes of creating a sex scandal. This plot was uncovered and Stephen was deposed for his role, but this shows just how deep the tensions ran. The Arian controversy was not just a debate over theology. It had become a struggle for power and influence, with both sides willing to go to extreme lengths to come out on top. Constans was eventually able to persuade his brother to readmit Athanasius, but the peace was short-lived. Constans was killed in 350, and by 353, Constantius was in complete control of the Roman Empire. By now, Liberius was pope, and he convened councils at Arles in 353 and Mediolanum in 355, but in both instances, the bishops were pressured by imperial troops to condemn Athanasius. Dissenters were exiled by Constantius. Liberius supported the exiled bishops, which earned him his own exile to Thrace. During his exile, Felix was installed as pope, but neither the people of Rome nor the leadership of the Western Church accepted his authority. When Liberius's exile was lifted, Constantius hoped that both Liberius and Felix would preside over the See of Rome as co-pontiffs. But Felix was expelled by the Roman people, leaving Liberius the sole pope. The Catholic Church, to this day, generally recognizes Felix as an anti-pope, with Liberius having been the rightful pontiff that entire time. We're now almost 3 decades since the Council of Nicaea. Arius is dead. Constantine is dead. but the Arian Controversy still divided the empire. By this point, though, the Arians had the upper hand, a big reversal from the early days of the Nicaean orthodoxy. In 357, at Sirmium, Arian bishops declared that Christ was subordinate to God the Father, and declared homoousios should not be used at all, saying that it went against Scripture. This was an extreme stance, and the next year at Ankara, bishops endorsed the idea of homoiousios, which again was the idea that Christ was of similar essence as God the Father. This position is between the Nicene stance and the Arian stance, and has since been dubbed semi-Arian. Although many historians now avoid this label, it is still a useful shorthand. Remember what I said about Arianism being a spectrum? We're seeing this now on full display. Constantius called 2 more councils to reconcile the differences between the two sides. One to be held at Ariminum, and one at Seleucia. The council at Ariminum followed the familiar formula. The Western bishops reaffirmed the Nicene Creed. Seleucia was more interesting, with the Arian hardliners and the semi-Arian moderates bitterly debating their sides. The hardliners came away with a majority, and Constantius called representatives from both Ariminum and Seleucia to meet in Constantinople in 360 to develop one singular, unified creed that both sides could support. The bishops, under the watchful eye of an Arian emperor, developed a creed that deliberately omitted both homoousios and homoiousios. In other words, one that was strongly Arian. This was the high water mark of Arianism. Around this time, St. Jerome famously wrote that the whole world groaned, astonished to find itself Arian. Constantius had played no small role in the Arian ascension, but he died in 361, and Julian rose to the throne. Known as Julian the Apostate, he was the last non-Christian emperor. He had no patience for petty Christian squabbles, but he also believed that these rifts could pull the church apart, so he was happy to fan the flames. He issued an edict allowing exiled bishops to return to their sees, which meant that Athanasius could return to Alexandria. Julian knew that bringing Athanasius back would only further the divide. But Julian underestimated Athanasius. He didn't just preach to his congregations. He built a large influence, even converting many pagans. And this Julian didn't like. So in 362, Athanasius was exiled. Again. Julian died on campaign in 363 and was succeeded by Jovian, who supported the Nicene orthodoxy and recalled Athanasius. Again. Upon Jovian's death, the empire was split between Valentinian and Valens. Valentinian supported Nicaea, but largely stayed out of the controversy. Valens did not support Nicaea. He favored the agreement reached at the Ariminum, Seleucia, Constantinople councils, and re-expelled the bishops who had previously been expelled by Constantius. More moderate and semi-Arian Eastern bishops were still opposed to the Ariminum, Seleucia, Constantinople agreement, and, getting nowhere with the Arian faction, appealed instead to Pope Liberius in Rome for support. Liberius demanded that they profess adherence to the Nicene Creed and denounce the Ariminum, Seleucia, Constantinople Creed. And these bishops surprisingly agreed. For the first time since 325, the anti-Arian factions were uniting. Bishops who had once rejected Nicaea now found Valens' adherence to Arianism to be a bridge too far. They found more common ground with the Orthodox Nicaeans. While Valens was pushing his Arian agenda, a fresh crop of brilliant theologians was breathing new life into the Nicene cause. Known as the Cappadocian Fathers, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzus, they started cleaning up the theological mess that Nicaea had left behind. They refined the terminology, explaining that God was a single essence, manifested in 3 individual persons. This was the theological breakthrough that had eluded the church for half a century. It allowed the Eastern bishops to accept homoousios without sacrificing the distinction between God the Father and Jesus Christ that they always wanted to preserve. It also matches the modern understanding of the Trinity. In 373, Athanasius, now in his mid-70s, died. It had been almost 50 years since the Council of Nicaea closed, and by now Arius, Constantine, Eusebius, and now Athanasius were all gone. But the controversy still consumed the empire. Violence broke out in Alexandria when Valens tried to install an Arian bishop to replace Athanasius. This was despite Athanasius having consecrated his own successor before he passed. The church at large was still trapped in the same endless cycle that had plagued the previous half-century. By 378, though, the tide started to turn. Valens was killed in the famous disaster at Adrianople, one of the most devastating defeats in Roman history. The eastern throne was then vacant, and it would be filled by Theodosius. Unlike Constantius and Valens, Theodosius was a staunch Nicaean. In 380, he issued the Edict of Thessalonica, which declared that the faith professed by the Bishop of Rome and the Bishop of Alexandria was to be the religion of the Roman Empire, while those who rejected it were to be regarded as heretics. This was a monumental shift. Not only was the Nicaean homoousios now fully backed by the Roman government, but Arian views were explicitly made illegal. This edict also identified the bishops of Rome and Alexandria as the leading guardians of orthodoxy. This represents an important moment in the growing prestige and influence of the Roman papacy. But the Roman See was not the only important bishopric. Constantinople's bishop, Demophilus, was still an Arian. Theodosius would not have this. He told Demophilus that he could keep his see only if he accepted the Nicene Creed. Demophilus declined and retired with some of his followers to Berea, leaving his see vacant. Gregory of Nazianzus, another staunch Nicaean, took up the task of converting Constantinople's citizenry back to Nicene orthodoxy. He delivered a series of fiery sermons, bringing the eastern capital back into the Orthodox fold. Gregory had imperial support to become the next bishop of Constantinople, but a separate group supported Maximus the Cynic, and had him consecrated during a secret ceremony in the middle of the night. Maximus was still a Nicaean, but this just further demonstrates how politically important these offices were. Anyone with any power whatsoever wanted their guy to be the guy. Gregory was very popular with the people of Constantinople after his series of sermons, and when word of this secret ceremony got out the next morning, the city nearly rioted. Maximus fled, leaving Gregory as the only bishop in the city. Maximus appealed to various church officials over the next several years, but was not able to wrangle the see away from Gregory. With the major cities now Nicaean and under Nicaean leadership, and with both eastern and western imperial thrones held by Nicaeans, Theodosius took the opportunity to convene the Second Ecumenical Council in Constantinople under his watch. 150 bishops, all from the eastern half of the empire, gathered in the Hagia Irene in Constantinople. Meletius of Antioch was elected to preside. It is notable that Western bishops did not attend this council. All attendees were from the portion of the empire that had been mostly Arian since the Council of Nicaea. The council's first act was to declare Maximus's consecration illegitimate, and install Gregory of Nazianzus as the bishop of Constantinople. But at this point, Meletius suddenly died, and the bishops temporarily broke the council for his funeral. When they reconvened, Gregory of Nazianzus was elected president of the council. Gregory, though, struggled to keep everything together. The bishops turned their eyes to the now vacant see of Antioch, previously held by Meletius. Around this time, additional bishops from Egypt and from Macedonia arrived in the capital city, late to the council, but still early enough to make their voices heard. This faction opposed Gregory strongly, and led the opposition to his chosen replacement for Antioch. Rather than allowing the divisions to worsen, Gregory stepped aside as president and as bishop of Constantinople. The bishops chose to replace him with Nectarius, a surprise choice since Nectarius had not even been baptized yet. But he was an imperial officer and he had the support of Theodosius, so the council elected him baptized him, and had him consecrated immediately. After weeks of political drama, the council finally turned to the matters they had convened to address. Over the next 2 months, they drafted and adopted 4 to 7 canons. The first 4 are, to this day, accepted by the Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, and Roman Catholic churches. The next 3 are only accepted by the Orthodox churches. This is because only the first 4 canons are in our oldest surviving sources for the council, and there is some evidence that the last 3 may have been later additions. The most significant of these canons are the first, which condemns Arianism, and the third, which states, "The Bishop of Constantinople, however, shall have the prerogative of honor after the Bishop of Rome, because Constantinople is the new Rome." This canon elevates the Bishop of Constantinople, a city that was still young and finding its footing as an imperial capital. And it was not without controversy. This one short sentence, passed almost as an administrative measure, would have consequences for the next 1,000 years. The council declared that the Bishop of Constantinople should rank second only to Rome, not because of apostolic tradition, but because Constantinople was the empire's new capital. Until this point, Alexandria and Antioch had generally occupied the second and third places of honor because of their apostolic connections to St. Mark and St. Peter, respectively. But here, Alexandria and Antioch are pushed aside to make room for Constantinople. Rome never accepted the principle, and a new rivalry between the old and the new capitals of Christendom had begun, with one claiming authority from the apostles and the other claiming authority from the emperors. But for now, the biggest story was that, after more than half a century of controversy, the bishops had finally accomplished what Constantine had hoped to achieve back at Nicaea. Arianism was condemned, the Nicaean faith was reaffirmed, and the church finally possessed the theological language needed to explain it. To affirm this, the bishops adopted a new creed, known as the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, which was essentially the Nicene Creed with some modifications. Although there is some controversy here too, as many scholars have argued that this creed was adopted later and only then attributed back to the First Council of Constantinople. Still, this council did more than settle a theological dispute. By elevating Constantinople as the new Rome, it planted the seeds of a new struggle over authority within the church, one that would continue for centuries. The Council of Constantinople brought one great conflict to an end, but it also helped shape the next chapter in the history of the church, one defined by a growing rivalry between Rome and Constantinople. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, the best way to support the channel is by clicking like and subscribe down below. And if you'd like to go a step further, you can support Byztory through PayPal or Buy Me a Coffee links in the description below. Every contribution helps make videos like this possible. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.